Okay. Hi, everyone. As you're logging in, there's a poll that you can fill out. We're going to get started in about a minute. The poll is anonymous, and it helps us get a better idea of who's tuning in. Also, before we get started, please be sure to keep checking the chat box, and I'll be giving reminders throughout. I'm going to be sharing links for how we can support Grassroots Al-Quds. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, please fill out the poll that's right there. It's going to help us get a better idea of who's listening. And then throughout this talk, I'll be sharing different links for how you can support Grassroots Al-Quds through PayPal and buying the book Wujood. Okay, so we're going to get started. First, thank you to everyone who's been spreading the word and who has registered and donated to Grassroots Al-Quds. These are tough circumstances, and any support you can give is extremely appreciated. My name is Zaina Rassan. I'm the co-director of a summer academy in Palestine called I Know I Can, and also a special educator in the Central Valley of California. So today we're going to get to hear from a group of brilliant leaders, speakers, and activists, centering our conversation on colonialism, the tourism industry in Jerusalem, and Grassroots Al-Quds' responses to these challenges. We're really, really lucky to have Fayrouz Sharqawi and Marc Lamont Hill lead us in conversation. So first, Fayrouz Sharqawi is the Global Mobilization Coordinator at Grassroots Al-Quds. This is a platform for Palestinian organizations and grassroots movements in Jerusalem. Grassroots Al-Quds, which is hosting this call, seeks to strengthen a Palestinian community mobilization and networking that builds Palestinian long-term strategies for Jerusalem. And we also are very blessed to have Marc Lamont Hill here. Marc Lamont Hill is a professor of media studies at Temple University. He's also the host of the new podcast, Coffee and Books. He's the author of 6 books, including the forthcoming, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. So, Fayrouz, if you could start our conversation by providing some political context around this conversation. So how have you seen Israeli colonialism impact the tourism industry in occupied Jerusalem?
Thank you, Zaina. Good evening, everybody. Well, yes, to provide some context, let's start with the fact that Jerusalem is a top tourist destination. And in normal times, not this year, but in normal times, a bit more than 3 million tourists visit Jerusalem every year. And the Israeli Ministry of Tourism has been doing a lot of work on advertising and inviting visitors to visit the city, and there has been a growth of almost 50% in the number of visitors and tourists arriving into Jerusalem in the last 4 years. So a huge number of tourists arrive into Jerusalem, visit the city every year, but only 20% of them stay in the Palestinian hotels, in the Palestinian side, in the eastern part of occupied Jerusalem. And this has a lot to do with the Israeli advertisement and propaganda in tourism, as well as to the fact that Israel stifles development in the eastern part of Jerusalem, not allowing planning, proper planning and development, not allowing the construction of homes or commercial centers, including hotels, businesses like hotels. And so looking at the numbers, comparing the number of hotel rooms in Jerusalem, you can feel this difference. There are currently 1,500 Palestinian hotel rooms in Jerusalem, as opposed to 15,000 Israeli hotel rooms. And this explains also why, out of those millions of tourists who stayed overnight in Jerusalem in recent years, only 20% stayed in our hotels, in Palestinian hotels. Now, speaking of the Israeli propaganda, of the Israeli advertisement, it is very easy to see how the Israeli official and also commercial advertisement in tourism hides away the Palestinian presence and existence in Jerusalem. It hides it from maps, literally official maps of Jerusalem. Looking at the map, the touristic map of Jerusalem that is issued by the Israeli Occupation Ministry of Tourism, you can see that there are huge parts of the eastern part of Jerusalem hidden. They are cut off. They are not shown on the map. Actually, the center of the map is the heart of the western part of Jerusalem. So even though politically, in politics, Israel does not miss a chance to declare the whole city its eternal capital, when it comes to them moving and controlling the movement of tourists, then very clearly they hide away the eastern part, they hide away our businesses, they hide away attractions that people can see, places they can visit, people they can meet. So looking at Israeli advertisements, also the web is full of them. You can see so many advertisements and videos that advertise for visiting Jerusalem, but do not show the Palestinian existence, do not show the Palestinian presence, and thus this presence is missing from the tourist experience when they visit Jerusalem. Now, it's also important to realize that there is a strong connection also between colonial expansion and the tourism industry in Jerusalem, especially in Jerusalem, everywhere in Palestine, but especially in Jerusalem. So it's not only about hiding away the Palestinians from advertisements, but also the strong connection between the expansion of the Israeli occupation and colonialism in Jerusalem, Israeli control over Jerusalem, over the eastern part of the city. It's very well connected to tourism projects. For example, last year, a bit more than a year ago, a new tourist project was authorized, was confirmed in Jerusalem, and it is the Jerusalem cable car. Now, usually I like cable cars. They're fun. It's a very nice experience. They challenge my fear of heights. And so it's a very nice idea. But looking at what it's going to do in Jerusalem, what its purpose is in Jerusalem, you can see how ugly it is. This cable car is not going to be beneficial economically to Israel. It's not a good business. It's not a good business adventure. Nonetheless, it is very important politically because it does enhance Israel's control over the eastern part, and it also pushes forward these policies of hiding away the Palestinian presence and controlling the movement of tourists into Israeli colonies and Israeli businesses. So this cable car is going to run from the west to the east. So we send all tourists to sleep in hotels in the western part of Jerusalem, but of course they want to visit the Mount of Olives because you cannot really take out this important part of Jerusalem from their experience. So we send them to the Mount of Olives through or on this cable car that takes them above Silwan, above Ras Al-Amud, so they do not go as they usually do, walking or driving through these Palestinian neighborhoods that they have to go through in order up the Mount of Olives, but rather they will be riding the cable car, not going into these Palestinian neighborhoods, reaching the Israeli national park in Silwan called the City of David, which is managed and controlled by a settler organization, the notorious Al-Quds settler organization. From there, the cable car will take the tourists to another settlement on the Mount of Olives, the settlement of Ma'aleh Hazitim inside Ras Al-Amud neighborhood. From there, they will be able to take a walk on a new promenade that will be built for them on the Mount of Olives, but this promenade is going to take them from one settlement to another, avoiding the option for them to walk around the streets of Ras Al Amoud or Tur, the Palestinian communities on the Mount of Olives. So these are just two examples of very new, fresh projects that build a very strong connection between the tourism industry in Jerusalem and the colonial expansion and the colonial goals and plans that the Israeli occupation has in Jerusalem. Now, of course, these are the Israeli policies, and at the same time, there is a very big international complicity with it. Looking at search engines, looking at booking agencies, so looking at Google, looking at Airbnb and Booking.com, looking at TripAdvisor and Lonely Planet, you see that they all take and adopt the Israeli propaganda and the Israeli narrative fully, not questioning it, not offering anything else. So, for example, the same map that Israel prints and distributes for Jerusalem is adopted by TripAdvisor. So you get the same map, you get it with the TripAdvisor logo, and as a tourist who might not be aware of the political reality in Jerusalem, you will be missing a lot. So this international complicity also supports a lot the Israeli policy and the Israeli control also in the tourism industry. You can, by the way, check it out for yourselves. Go to Google and Google hairdresser East Jerusalem and check out the first 10 results or 20 results you will get. They will all be Israeli businesses, most probably in the western part, but if in the eastern part, then in Israeli colonies and settlements in the eastern part. So just one example about how this international complicity is reflected. Now, this has very severe results and very harsh effects on the Palestinians in Jerusalem. The first one, politically. Millions of people visit Jerusalem every year, but they, with these Israeli plans, will less and less be able to see the occupation physically on the ground. They will not walk around the streets of Silwan and see how it is a big ghetto, how Silwan is a big refugee camp in the middle of the city. They will not be able to see soldiers in our streets. They will not be able to see bulldozers demolishing our homes in our neighborhoods. And so politically, Israel is hiding away the occupation. And then, of course, also connected to the political aspect of it, economically, this makes the Palestinian economy suffer in Jerusalem. 40% of our economy in Jerusalem is tourism, and with Israel stealing away the tourist movement and visitors from our neighborhoods, then we also lose a lot of money. And with Palestinians being very poor in Jerusalem, there is an 80% poverty rate among Palestinians in Jerusalem. So this economic suffocation is clearly another tool of displacement that basically that's the end goal, displacing more and more Palestinians from Jerusalem, in this case by making it very hard for them to economically survive in this very expensive city. So this is the context that led to the publishing of Wujood.
Thank you, Fayrouz. I want to expand on this a little bit more. You mentioned a little bit about how the international world is compliant. So I want to direct the next question to Marc. As an American citizen visiting Jerusalem, can you tell us what stood out to you, or speak on how what you saw compares to US's colonialist systems?
There we go. I think I've unmuted myself. Sorry, I was having a little tech problem. First of all, thank you for the question, and I'd like to thank Fayrouz and Grassroots Jerusalem for inviting me. This is an incredible honor, and the work of Grassroots Jerusalem is so important for providing people with proper information, for proper access to what's happening on the ground. The work they do politically, intellectually, may not even be fully appreciated in this historical moment. It may be 20 years from now or 50 years from now when we look back and really understand how critical Grassroots Al-Quds has been to this moment and to the work of creating freedom, justice, and self-determination for the Palestinian people. So I'm honored to play even a small part in this conversation. And I'm learning so much as I always do from Fayrouz. I'm learning so much in this conversation to just listen. So I'll be somewhat brief. The first thing you asked me was what I noticed when, what I observed sort of on the ground as an American citizen coming. And so part of what I would say is there's my pre-Wujood experience and my post-Wujood experience. I've been to Palestine many times, and you know, the first trips that I made, I didn't have access to the kind of experiences that I had later after meeting people who gave me the proper tour and the proper information, allowed me to make judgments for myself about what I was seeing. So the first time I get there, I land in Tel Aviv. The first few times I'm in Palestine, I go to Tel Aviv. I land in Ben Gurion Airport. I go through the very long security line. Still not entirely clear why the line needs to be that long. And the first thing I notice is who's getting pulled out of line and who's not. This is even more the case in Amman, but when I'm in Tel Aviv, it's you know, when I'm looking at people who live inside of 48, Palestinians who live inside of 48, and I didn't know who they were at the time. I just noticed that a whole bunch of brown people were getting pulled out of the line. A whole bunch of Muslims were getting pulled out of the line. I noticed that, you know, as a Black person in America, I'm used to being the security threat. And it was the first moment where, like, me being Black didn't seem to be the biggest thing that people were looking for. They were like South Asians, they were Arabs, they were, you know, other people who were they were like, oh no, sir, you're fine, keep going. I was like, oh shit, this must be what white people feel like. But there was also this incredible discomfort with watching the way this particular racial state operates. This is all part of tourism, right? Because this is where the colonial project begins as a tourist. It's the moment you land. And so then you wait in line, and then you give them the passport and the next or whatever ID you have, and you then are told, you're then asked a bunch of questions, not the least of which is, where do you plan to go? So there's already, and it's very clear from the security, from their demeanor, from the tone of their questions, that certain answers are acceptable and certain answers are not. If I say that I'm going to El Khalil, if I'm going to Hebron, I get a very different response than if I say, oh, I'm going to Akka, I'm going to Haifa, to have, you know, to tour. If I say that I'm here to see Jesus, and then I can get away with going to Bethlehem. I can say I'm going to Bethlehem, but what are you doing in Bethlehem? Oh, I'm going to Manger Square. Oh, I want to see the Banksy, right? I want to go to, you know, the Waldorf Hotel, excuse me. Those are the kinds of answers that are acceptable, which stand in sharp contrast to, oh, I plan to go to Ramallah. I plan to be in El Beirut, you know, to hang out. I'm going to Karaj for a party. Them kind of answers that get you stuck in the airport. And so it's very clear where you should go and where you shouldn't go, what's acceptable and what's not. And this isn't by law, right? This is by custom. So you immediately get indoctrinated into this idea that certain places are good and certain places are not. When you leave, just like when you come, the first question I was asked the first time I returned to Ben Gurion was, did you see any Arabs? Were you around any? I mean, what a bizarre question to be asked. Even if I only went to Jerusalem, even if I only went to Tel Aviv, right? Even if I only, you know, it would be nearly impossible to not encounter Arabs. So the question isn't really, did you see any Arabs, right? The question really is, what were you doing with them? So you immediately understand that even if everyone is a citizen, just using the logic that, you know, the kind of Zionist logic that, you know, 20% of Israel are made up of Arabs. Let's say that's true, right? That 20%, even if I just stayed inside of 48 and I interacted, then I got a 1 in 5 chance on every human interaction of seeing what they call Arabs, what we're rightly calling Palestinian people. So again, it's not about that. It's about letting the tourists know that certain places are worth going and certain places are not. So then I get in the car, right, with no explanation of where or why. I get dropped off not inside of, the car might drop me in Sheikh Jarrah only because like the American colonies there, but there are a whole bunch of places like where I won't get dropped off. I'll get dropped off in front of an Israeli settlement inside of Jerusalem, but I won't get dropped off in the neighborhood that I want to be in if I'm going to a Palestinian neighborhood 9 times out of 10. So now the transportation industry is letting me know where I can go and where I can't go. Because if I go to any hood in the world, if the taxi won't take me there, I'm thinking that ain't where I'm supposed to be. Right? If I'm in New York back in New York in the 90s, and they say, oh, we ain't going to Central Harlem. Oh, we ain't going to East New York. We're not going to that part of Brooklyn. We'll take you to Times Square, right? It tells me that this neighborhood is a good neighborhood. This neighborhood is a bad neighborhood. So again, we're already the tourism industry from there. Then when you actually get into the actual practice of going through different sites, Fayrouz made a great point. When I'm looking for a barbershop, there's a wonderful Palestinian barbershop in the old city. I can't find it on no map. I had to just find somebody who had hair like mine and be like, yo, where you get your hair cut? If I'm looking for a great restaurant, if I'm looking for, you know, I'm you know, I don't drink per se often, no more than 3 times a day. But if I were a drinker and I wanted to find a good bar, you know, my Google searches wouldn't produce one for me. The best restaurants I couldn't find one on the map. Hairdressers, hotels. It's very difficult to find. There are a bunch of wonderful Palestinian hotels inside the old city, both at nearly every gate where there are hotels, but you can't find them on the map. So the map itself doesn't allow me to see this. Now, understand, from a Palestinian perspective, it's about erasure. From an American perspective, which is my perspective, I don't know it exists. So I'm not like, hey, why aren't there any more Palestinian hotels? I just assume there aren't any. I'm like, where's the Palestinian barbershop? I just assume I can't find one. So when somebody tells, so then when the tour guide, when an Israeli tour guide says, oh, well, you should go to Tel Aviv, or this is the part of the racial code, go to South Tel Aviv to get your haircut, Mark, you know, then it's like, I assume that that's all there is to it. I assume those are my only options. When I watch tour groups get taken through the old city, which is where I have spent most of my time and where I conducted the bulk of my research, I'm listening to people tell people, don't stop, don't look, don't buy. Don't stop, don't look, don't buy. And so what they're talking about is when I enter the old city through Damascus Gate, through Bab al-Amud, there are a ton of Palestinian cafes, a ton of Palestinian vendors. And they all sell the same, I mean, they're all selling the same stuff, right? Whether you like it or not, it's the same kind of stuff. But we're told to not even look there. Don't buy there, right? We're told that this, again, the danger. So if from the airport, I'm told, you know, I'm implicitly told that these are shady people to be around. And then I can't get dropped off in the neighborhood from the transportation industry. And then my tour guide tells me, don't stop, don't look, don't buy. The same stuff that's down the hall. And then they build, and they say, oh, if you go through, you know, so the difference between going through Damascus Gate and going through the new gate or going through Jaffa Gate, these are all, that each gate produces new possibilities for what I can or should be buying. All of this sends a message, right? When I'm trying to go to Aqsa, and as I'm going through, attempting to go through the African quarter, right? There's security there. There's a basically what technically would be called a flying checkpoint because it's not set up, but they're there every day that I've ever been there for the last 5 years. But there's also vendors behind there. But if every time I want to buy something, I have to go and show my passport and explain who I am and what I'm doing, which is very different than what happens when I try to go to the Western Wall or when I try to go through other sites. If I try to go to Church of the Sepulchre, it's much easier to navigate. I don't need to show ID on the front end. So they're dissuading people from purchasing things on this end. So for me, the tourism that's what I experienced. It's only after I knew. It's only after I meet an Ali Jeddah in the old city who says, wait a minute, there's other stuff to see. It's only after I encounter Grassroots Al-Quds and I get a proper tour throughout the city that I understand it. There's one more thing that I wanted to say because I thought it was a pretty neat thing. In Al-Wujood, they asked, because you asked about the comparison. And so inside of Al-Wujood, which by the way is a wonderful, wonderful book, and anyone who doesn't have it should absolutely purchase it. It radically reorganized my thinking about about the city of Jerusalem. No matter what you think you know about Jerusalem, this is helpful. If you're a first-time visitor, you can't live without it, not well. But if you think you know a lot about Jerusalem, it still is a useful resource. But she said, or the book says, excuse me, what if in your neighborhood waste management was a monthly bonfire? What if there was running water, but only 6 hours a day? Sidewalks were a novelty and playgrounds were unheard of. What if building permits were systematically denied to people like you and your neighbor received a municipal demolition order again? What if 78% of your community lived below the poverty line and the kids were running around outside all day because schools were too crowded to hold them? What if an 8-meter concrete wall blocked all the roads to the university campus? And what if, God forbid, there was an emergency and the ambulance took hours to arrive because it was stuck at a military checkpoint? And what if gun-toting crazies moved up the road and daily marched in front of your grandparents' house yelling, "This is my land"? And what if you called the police because you were scared they'd shoot, only to be yourself arrested? As a Black person living in America, there are ways that that resonates with me. And there are ways that it does not. And we can talk about that later when we talk about solidarity. I do not believe, and I'm always reluctant or resistant to those who say that being Palestinian is like being Black, or being Black is like being Palestinian. Every condition is different. Every context is different. Everyone is forced to wrestle with a set of circumstances that are singular in certain ways, although there are connections that bind us together or should bind us together. But when I go to Palestine and I'm traveling through the city and I look at what is happening in East Jerusalem versus West Jerusalem, it does remind me of what happens in many urban cities in the United States. I can, if I'm in West Jerusalem, if I'm on, you know, Jaffa Street and I'm looking and I see people sitting outside in cafes and the streets are clean and it looks like a European city, and suddenly I go I walk just a few meters over and now there's trash in the street and the cars are double parked everywhere and there's an odd smell, and of course it's Palestine, so there's 75,000 cats everywhere. And if all of this is in my thing, then if I don't know any better, I would make the same assumptions that people often make about Black people in the United States. If I don't know that the trash pickup isn't happening and that municipal resources are not distributed 50-50 or even congruent with the population of Jerusalem, then I would think the Palestinians don't know how to pick up trash, not knowing that their trash is never picked up. If I don't understand how parking works or how streets work or how cars are allowed to park, if I don't understand the permit system, then I would think the Palestinians just park in the middle of the street because they're lazy or because they are uncivilized, right? And of course, given these Orientalist narratives about what the East looks like in relation to the West, it's even more sort of compelling a narrative to think about West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem as a microcosm of what the West looks like versus the East in terms of the kind of Orientalist imagination that Edward Said talked about. So for me, when I travel there as an American, if I don't know any better, I would think the Palestinians are uncivilized and that the Israelis are the civilized folk, as opposed to understanding that there are a set of material conditions that force people to make particular choices. Palestinians don't burn trash because they don't like dumpsters, right? They don't park in the middle of the street because they don't like straight lines, right? They don't not vote in elections because they're unmotivated. Even in the Jerusalem elections, we have to talk about what are the conditions that make that an improper choice. And so for me as an American, until I get access to proper information, books like Wujood and organizations like Grassroots Al-Quds, then I am forced to make wrong-headed assumptions, which is precisely what the colonial project is about. It's not just about, the settler colonial project is about dislocation. It's about, we can call it transfer or whatever, but it's about pushing people away. It's about expulsion of people from their own land. But it's about replacement. But it's also about a certain type of memory project. It's about a certain type of political use of memory, such that we erase. Settler colonialism is about erasure as well. And so if I can post up signs in Jerusalem that make me think that things went this way versus that way, if I can alter history and not talk about what was really at stake in 1948, if I can change and Hebraicize all the signs so that even in Arabic, I'm reading Yerushalayim and not Al-Quds for Jerusalem, then I can begin to erase or forget And as a public memory, collective memory, we can forget just how long, just how invested, just how significant the Palestinian presence has been in this land. And so the tourism industry is reflective of that. No, and this is the last thing I'll say, nothing better reflects what we remember and what we forget than tourism, because I come in not knowing anything. So if I walk into, and it's not just Jerusalem, if I walk into Khalil and I find out that, and I hear that X number of people were murdered, if the sign says like 122 Jews were killed in the Hebron massacre, but we don't mention that 118 Palestinians were killed, then suddenly we don't have proper context, right? If we don't talk about what the Arab revolts were about, then we don't have context. And to be very clear, I'm not minimizing the death of anybody. I'm simply saying we need a proper historical analysis. And the tourism industry, the tourist industry is, particularly the American tourism industry, is a key place where we watch this process of erasure, or what someone in the comments said as memoricide. Because as Americans, it's much easier for us to support with our tax dollars, to support with our votes, a set of colonial policies that continue to strengthen the occupation and lead to the expulsion of Palestinians, if we believe that it's true. And so everybody who says, well, I went to the Holy Land and I saw it for myself. Yeah, but what did you see? How did you see it? That's the problem.
Thank you so much to both Marc and Fayrouz. We want to continue the conversation. We're going to put a little pause to hear from testimonials in a bit. But I also want to let everyone know there have been some questions in the comments section. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens where you can put in your questions. At the end of this talk, we'll have some time dedicated to picking a few of those questions for Marc and Fayrouz to answer. So you can fill them out in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so we are going to take a moment, and we're going to take a moment to move on to testimonials. And before we do that, I also want to share one more time, because I see a lot more people have signed in. There are many ways that you can support Grassroots Al-Quds. I will link their PayPal and the book Wujood that Marc was talking about in the chat box, so you can check that out there. Okay, so we're going to move on to our testimonials. We have two wonderful speakers today, Andom and Ramah. We're going to start with Andom. So Andom Ghebreghiorgis is a first-generation American of Eritrean descent from Mount Vernon, New York. He graduated from Yale with degrees in political science and economics in 2007, and later with a master's in secondary special education. He taught middle school special education in New York for the majority of his professional career, and was in Ramallah teaching English writing at IKIC, I Know I Can, the summer of 2018. Andom was recently a Democratic candidate for Congress in the New York 16th District, Southern Westchester, and the North Bronx. So Andom, whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Zaina, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Andom Ghebreghiorgis, and I had the privilege of going to Palestine in 2018 with I Know I Can. Actually, Marc spoke at the I Know I Can Summer Academy, and as a New Yorker, of course, I had to show him a couple things on the basketball court. And Fayrouz as well, I met on the Grassroots Jerusalem political tour. So I'm happy to be sharing virtual space with everyone here today. It's certainly a crazy time right now in America, throughout the world. I think just speaking about the historic moment that we're in right now, the Overton window on policing has changed probably more in the last 2-3 months than it has maybe in the last 3 decades. And I think that there's a clear connection between what's happening here and what's going on in Palestine, certainly from a racial justice perspective, in particular, Black justice. Black people in the United States, they live under a racist regime that targets our communities with racial profiling, mass incarceration, surveillance, state-sanctioned violence. And here in New York, we see the effects of U.S. police training, what happens with the Israeli military through deadly exchange, the resource-sharing tactics of state repression. The U.S. funds the subjugation of Black people here, as well as Palestinians. We see it with millions of dollars going to police departments across the country, and we also see it with nearly $4 billion in military aid to Israel every single year. Increasing policing, increasing militarization, and the violence associated with those things, it's rooted in anti-Black and also anti-Palestinian racism. And so when we talk about Palestinian liberation, we know that this exists within a broader struggle for human rights. It exists in a global context. It exists in a struggle against white supremacy. And we also know that Black liberation cannot happen without Palestinian liberation, right? Marc was speaking a little bit about solidarity. So racial justice, it knows no borders, and we have to be internationalists in our thinking. We have to stand in solidarity with oppressed peoples throughout the world, ever more so because we know oppressive state actors already work together, whether they be the NYPD, ICE, or the so-called IDF. I want to add, though, as an Eritrean American, an extra sort of layer to this in terms of racial justice in Palestine that's often not discussed. And this sort of was the context for my trip when I went in 2018. I have some family that lives in South Tel Aviv. There were, in 2015, about 65 to 70,000 African refugees in 48. Today, there are 32,000. And the reason why that is because the policy of the Israeli government was to make the lives of African refugees so miserable that they self-deport. You have the likes of Miri Regev, who said that African refugees were like a cancer in their body. And then afterwards, she apologized for that, not for being xenophobic or anti-African, but she apologized to cancer survivors. You have people throughout the Israeli Knesset who just say things that you would not even believe, calling African and Black people monkeys. You have people in ethnic cleansing and genocide in Darfur saying and seeing that what is going on in Israel is so terrible for African refugees that they would much rather self-deport to a third country, risk going to Libya, which is a failed state in many ways, and even cross the Mediterranean, where you know that there are waves of death awaiting Black people. And so why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up first in the context that Israel uses the 1954 law of infiltration that was applied to Palestinians after the Nakba now to Black refugees fleeing violence and dictatorship. They use racist rhetoric against African people that people in the past had all thought, oh, this is only applied to Palestinians. But they also use it because something that is going to be important when we think about the context of what's going on in Jerusalem, but also the entire West Bank and 48, is the idea of a demographic threat. These non-white, non-Jewish Black people, who've only numbered in 70,000, appear to be a demographic threat to the ethno-nationalist settler colonial state that is Israel. And this really serves as a foundation to understanding that, look, you hear the rhetoric about, oh, Palestinians are not willing to come to the table. Oh, the Palestinians are terrorists. They say, well, what are you talking about when we're talking about babies who are fleeing violence and who are fleeing dictatorship? The point isn't about these actors. It's not about that. The point is that Israel intends to maintain control over its entire borders in a racist manner. And this is really the foundation of Zionism. It is rooted in settler colonialism. It is rooted in white supremacy. And it is not about who is attacking at this exact moment. It will come for everyone that actually challenges the power of the state in even an ethnic or demographic way. And so what happens is, what is actually going to be exacted when that is the primary focus of a government? When you view anyone as a demographic threat, what are you willing to do? What is justice then when that is the space that you're operating in? And so for me, I had this understanding going into Jerusalem. I had this understanding going into Palestine. And when you take the Grassroots Jerusalem political tour, you see the home demolitions, you see the land confiscation, you see the ethnic cleansing that is happening there. Well, you can make a connection and understanding what the state is actually doing. And it's extremely important to understand, because as someone who wants to act in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and myself there going as a teacher, I didn't want to support a settler colonial state that was going to profit off of the exploitation of folks in Jerusalem or in 48 or anywhere. I also wanted to make sure that I was not voyeuristically commodifying this Palestinian experience for my own, progressive political purpose. I wanted to center the voices of those who I hope to be able to learn from and act in solidarity with, and bear witness to those experiences. When I came back to America, I could speak to it objectively. And that's what Grassroots Jerusalem does. That's what Grassroots Jerusalem is. And that's what I'm thankful for, to have been able to go on that trip and witness it firsthand, make the connections to the experiences that I had, that I knew, to the historical understanding that I had, and then be able to bring that back to the United States to speak, again, not as if I'm some, gringo in the South Bronx or some American on a vela tour in Rio, but as someone who really was listening and witnessing in solidarity and in partnership. And so that's why it's extremely important for everyone to be supporting Grassroots Jerusalem. As a visitor, you're going to see the current realities. You're going to see the resistance that Palestinian communities have been doing amidst, Israel's suffocation, amidst Israel's occupation, amidst, the land confiscations and demolitions. And for me, it was on a personal level, it was just great to experience that and meet Fayrouz in 2018, and then connect it with the experience I had in IKIC, where I was a teacher, which was a really odd dynamic because I had this very fleeting experience where I was living in Ramallah, and in some ways was experienced occupation, but not really, because I was going back to New York and I was teaching I felt like I lived in Long Island and taught in the Bronx, like, some of my co-teachers and friends. But one of the things that has stayed with me, not only through Grassroots Jerusalem, but also through teaching in I Know I Can in Ramallah, particularly with the young people, is the collective grief, the historical memory, but most importantly, the resilience and the optimism that the Palestinian youth have, that the people of Jerusalem have, and that all of us have together when we're operating in solidarity. So I just want to thank Fayrouz for allowing me to take part in that trip, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak here and support Grassroots Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thanks, Andom. It's good to see you and hear from you. Next, we're going to hear from Ramah Awad. Ramah is a local community organizer at the Mejdal Community Center in San Diego. She also serves on the National Executive Board of the Palestinian Youth Movement, who's sponsoring this talk. They are a grassroots organization of Palestinian and Arab youth actively struggling for the liberation of their homeland and people. Ramah, can you tell us a little bit about your experiences in Jerusalem?
Sure. Thank you, Zaina, and thank you to everyone at Grassroots Al-Quds for having me. Fayrouz and the team asked me to share my experiences visiting Jerusalem or Al-Quds, specifically as a Palestinian who has lived outside of Palestine for most of my life, to speak to questions around, what is not commonly known about the Palestinian condition in Jerusalem. How does tourism play a role in the ongoing Zionist erasure of Palestinians there? But what I would like to speak to today is more about the Palestinian experience of exclusion from Jerusalem, because for me, that shapes much of my relationship to the city. And this is also true for millions of Palestinians who are systematically denied entry or access to Jerusalem. And so this goes for the Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, which is only a 20-minute drive from Jerusalem. And of course, for the millions exiled beyond Palestine, living in surrounding countries as refugees, or those who have been exiled or born in diaspora in Europe and America and so on. And so this experience of exclusion, like the experiences of direct and physical dispossession, which Fayrouz was speaking to earlier, that look like home demolitions, the revoking of the Jerusalem ID, the intentional under-resourcing of Palestinian communities, as Marc was talking about. These are all part of larger plans to erase the Palestinian presence from Jerusalem and all of Palestine. And so we have Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who are being held captive. We have Palestinians in Jerusalem who are being forced out. We have Palestinians in 48 who are being forced to assimilate. And we have Palestinians from the outside who are being excluded from entering or accessing Palestine and Jerusalem. So I think most would agree that it's a given that borders and denied access through these constructed and militarized borders are a central part of the Palestinian experience. And so I want to share a quote from Rashid Khadidi's book on Palestinian identity, which for me really resonates and I think speaks to this universal experience of Palestinian exclusion. He wrote the quintessential Palestinian experience, which illustrates some of the most basic issues raised by Palestinian identity, takes place at a border, an airport, a checkpoint. For it is at these borders and barriers that 6 million Palestinians are singled out for special treatment and are forcefully reminded of their identity. As a result, at each of these barriers, which most others take for granted, every Palestinian is exposed to the possibility of harassment, exclusion, and sometimes worse, simply because of their identity. And so for myself personally, as a Palestinian who was born in exile, but who has lived in Palestine, and I often visit both immediate and extended family back home, my experience with Jerusalem is largely about navigating these borders and fighting for access to the city. And oftentimes that's come to actually fighting, at the checkpoint for access to the city in quite literal terms. But from my own experiences on paper, I am barred from visiting Jerusalem, even though I hold US citizenship. And this is because I hold a Palestinian ID card, which we refer to as al-Hawiyya, which grants me residency in the West Bank. But as a West Bank resident, I require permits from the Israeli government in order to visit Jerusalem. So here you might be asking, or maybe this has not crossed your mind, is, well, doesn't your US passport allow you to travel freely? And the answer here is no. I'm not allowed to travel because as a Palestinian American on paper and with dual citizenship, I'm systematically barred from flying through Tel Aviv and therefore accessing any areas of 1948 Palestine, which right now includes Jerusalem. So instead, I'm compelled to travel through Jordan, through a series of checkpoints, as most Palestinians who hold the identity card are forced to do. So to the Israeli government, my status or my claims as a US citizen are negated or denied because of my Palestinian identity and because I am actively deciding to hold on to that identity on paper. And I hold on to my Hawiyya, which I inherited from my mom, because it enables me to return to Palestine. It's the only thing that will guarantee me entry or access. But of course, this is not the case for the vast majority of Palestinians. For instance, my father's family has had their Jerusalem ID cards revoked. And so in legal terms, on paperwork, they are no longer Palestinian. They no longer have a stake to Palestine, to their homeland. So they can travel on their American passports to Tel Aviv, but as is the case with most Palestinians who travel through Tel Aviv, they're often interrogated, harassed, they are denied entry, they are deported at the border because of their activism on Palestine, or because of a Palestinian last name, or because of Palestinian lineage. So really because of their Palestinian identity. And so this is what Khalidi was referring to. And so for the majority of Palestinians, they are barred from Palestine because they don't have an ID card, but they're also denied access to Jerusalem simply because they are Palestinian. And so here, the irony, or I would say rather the racist design or the apartheid design of this practice, is that regardless of what kind of paperwork you have as a Palestinian, you will face exclusion from Palestine and Jerusalem in different ways. So for me, and as Andom was outlining, it's clear that this is by design because Israel is based on the ongoing erasure of Palestinian presence in Palestine. And this is, and that erasure is also based on physical displacement and control of Palestinian movement, as well as on dispossession. So dispossession of land, dispossession of property, and really dispossession of Palestinian livelihood. This erasure is also done through weakening and eliminating any relationships Palestinians in exile or in diaspora have to Palestine itself. And this is done intentionally to weaken the claims of future generations of Palestinians to their homeland. And so for the millions of Palestinians in exile who have been double expelled or triple expelled, it is at the borders and the checkpoints that they're experiencing this erasure. So between Jordan and Israel, between the West Bank and Israel. And in recent years, we've seen a new border emerge between Turkey and Greece for the thousands of Palestinians who are now been doubly displaced. And so it's at these borders that Palestinians are experiencing erasure, alienation, and dispossession from our homeland. And so on the topic of tourism, for every Palestinian that is denied return or access to their ancestral homeland, there's probably like 10 or 20-fold the number of tourists and immigrants and settlers who have free access to Palestine and Jerusalem and have more access to naturalizing themselves in a homeland or a land that is foreign to them. And this is really one of the defining natures of Israel as a settler colonial state that is seeking to indigenize itself at the cost of Palestinian access and livelihood in Palestine. And here, I think it's really important to highlight the role of the US in facilitating this process. So whether that's through the billions of military funding or blind political support for Israel's violation of international law and Palestinian determination, and specifically with Jerusalem, to add injury to the wound, in 2017, Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by moving the US embassy as a way to further normalize Israeli colonization and to further make what is foreign to this region a natural part of it. So with that, I hope that this shed light on the fact that, you know, we cannot even get to Jerusalem. And with that comes, I think, the added responsibilities for those visiting Palestine to join us in an active struggle. And despite that struggle, Al-Quds remains a North Star for Palestinians globally. And we do maintain Al-Quds lana, that Jerusalem is ours. So thank you.
Thank you, Ramah. Al-Quds lana, thank you so much. That was beautiful. And to speak on what you just said about having people join in solidarity, I want to remind everyone that one of our main goals today is to really support Grassroots Al-Quds, the organization we've been hearing about so much, and their book Wujood. I will again share some links to their PayPal and the book, where the link to the PDF, so you can purchase it online. Also, in a bit, in about like 20 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A between Marc and Fayrouz. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. If you're on the Facebook Live, you can add them in the comments and we'll try to go through and pick from that selection. Okay, so Marc and Fayrouz, you both gave us some really wonderful context on what is happening with tourism in Jerusalem, as well as some comparisons to what's going on in the US. What I want to hear now is, now that we've gained this knowledge on Israeli propaganda and Jerusalem tourism, could you speak more to what Grassroots Al-Quds has been doing to challenge these structures? And to both of you, why is a book like Wujood so important right now?
Yes, I would like to expand a bit more and speak about our global mobilization at Grassroots Al-Quds. You know, we established Grassroots Al-Quds almost 10 years ago. And when we started the organization, we had very traditional funding from very traditional donors who dictated their agendas, who dictated what we should be doing. And part of what we were told to do was advocacy. And when you speak about advocacy in Palestine, this usually means that you write perfect reports with perfect English citing international law and international conventions, talking about Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights, having proof included in that report, dressing up in a suit or at least a buttoned shirt and going to meet with decision makers, meet with ambassadors or consuls, meet with parliament members, and talk to decision makers from around the world about how important it is that they first of all discover the big news about human rights violations in Palestine, and then that they apply diplomatic pressure on Israel to stop it. This is what is meant by advocacy usually when you are in Palestine, especially at an organization, an NGO. And so we did this. We did this because we didn't know better. And after 2-3 years of doing this, we realized many things are wrong with this structure. First of all, it does not bring any results. It does not make a difference because it's not at all about human rights or international law in the world. It's all about economic benefit, who's making money of my political reality and who has the power to maintain this political reality. And so we decided that we will stop wasting our time and resources and effort and emotions on this kind of advocacy, and we mainly shifted our advocacy from the top level decision makers to grassroots around the world. And we decided to rename it Global Mobilization because that's more what we do. And the Global Mobilization Department at Grassroots Al-Quds does exactly this. It tackles all of the points that were made by all of the speakers today about how, and not only in tourism, how Israeli policies and Israeli propaganda work hand in hand also in tourism in order to displace Palestinians, dispossess Palestinians, disempower Palestinians. And so we decided that we first of all give political tours, because we realized that there are so many people coming to Jerusalem not knowing about the reality in the city, not knowing what it means to be a Palestinian living in Jerusalem, not knowing how imminent the threat of being displaced, how real it is. It's not just an imaginary scenario that you say it will not happen to me. It's very real to so many people. There are 350,000 Palestinians living within the Israeli occupation's municipal boundary of Jerusalem, and they all feel this threat of being pushed out of the city, forced out of the city. And so we started providing our political tours, and our political tours provide the story, the political context, also a little bit of the history that led up to this context. And that was our answer to the misinformation and disinformation that is rampant around the world when it comes to Palestine. People have no idea what's happening. Even when they visit, they don't really get the full picture. So we started providing this tour. And in 2014, we published the first edition of Wujood. Wujood is Arabic for presence or existence. And Wujood is the first political tourist guidebook to Jerusalem. We call it the Grassroots Guide to Jerusalem. And we published the first edition in 2014 and the second edition last year in 2019. We're having this webinar on Wujood tonight. The plan for us for 2020 was to come tour with the book in the US. Of course, this plan was postponed, and I'm hoping that we get to do it as soon as possible. Now, Wujood is, first of all, a tourist guidebook to Jerusalem. And what it does is uncover the hidden Jerusalem. So I spoke in the first part about how the Israeli propaganda, the Israeli advertisement and policies hide away the Palestinian existence and presence in Jerusalem. So what Wujood does is highlight it. It tells you about it. It shows you this presence and tells visitors where they can go visit in Jerusalem, all of these treasures that are hidden away from them, because it's not only the Palestinian hotels that they are missing, it's not only the Palestinian restaurants or bars, but it's also the Palestinian hike trails, it's the Palestinian water springs, it's the maqams in different villages around the city. So there is so much for people to see, so much beauty for people to see in the eastern part of Jerusalem that is taken away from this experience, and Wujood presents it to the visitors. So there is, first of all, what to see, but also where to stay, where to eat, where to drink, and where to shop. This information is provided in the first chapter of Wujood, which is called While in Jerusalem. So it tells you exactly, Marc was speaking about not finding those hotels or guest houses or restaurants on the map. So we put them on the map. We tell you, we list all of these hotels, we list places for people to stay, places for people to shop. Where are the Palestinian commercial areas? Where are the Palestinian shops and businesses that are outside of the old city? Where how can I get to these places by bus? Because, for example, in Jerusalem, there is a Palestinian bus company and bus lines that take you to the eastern part of Jerusalem, and usually you cannot find information about them anywhere but in Wujood, for example. So if you want to make it to Hizma, if you want to make it to Al-Izariyya, if you want to make it to Battir or Al-Walaja, Wujood would tell you where to take the bus from and how to get there, and no other guide would tell you, would provide you with that information. The next chapter that is called the story of the city is the chapter that provides the political reality, the political story and the political context in Jerusalem. It tells the history, but also the reality today, and what are these displacement policies that define Israel's colonial behavior in Jerusalem, whether it's legal status or planning and urban planning policies, land confiscation, home demolition, the suffocation of economy, tourism also. It talks about the tourism industry and so on. The third chapter talks about the people of the city. It tells you the stories of the Palestinian communities. There are around 40 Palestinian communities in the Jerusalem district. These are neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods inside the city. These are villages around the city and 2 refugee camps that are located inside the Jerusalem district. So we tell the stories of these communities. We tell the political reality, but again, what they have to offer their visitors. So you know where to go, what cooperative to visit in order to have lunch or to buy your souvenirs, what hike you can do and take in these areas, and so on. Now, the fourth chapter in Wujood does the same for other Palestinian cities. It's a smaller scale, not so much detail as we did about Jerusalem, but the chapter around Palestine tells you also how to be a responsible, ethical tourist in cities like Haifa, Akka, Nazareth, Jericho, Hebron, Nablus, and many other Palestinian cities. So we tell you about their reality, we tell you about tours you can take there, we tell you where you can eat and shop in these areas as well. In addition, Wujood includes Palestinian maps of Jerusalem. It includes our own glossary where we explain some of the terms and expressions that we use, because language is important and the choice of words is important. So we explain the specific choices of words that we made in the book. And we also finish with recommended readings and films for people to enrich their knowledge about Jerusalem. Now, Ramah was also talking about not being able to access Jerusalem. So, and we did take this into consideration. Wujood is a big book, and it's not just or only a tourist guidebook for Jerusalem, but it's also a book about Jerusalem to have at home on your shelf. If you cannot make it to Jerusalem, if you cannot visit because you are not allowed, whether you are a Palestinian or someone who is on some list that says you cannot enter Palestine because you are a troublemaker or whatever definition they give you, then you can read about Jerusalem and Palestine through Wujood. For example, we had this big question about Wujood, especially in the Arab world, because we, in our opinion and our standpoint as a Palestinian organization, we would rather not encourage people to come and normalize and visit Jerusalem if they are, I mean, right now, the Emirates is in the news. And of course, we oppose to this kind of normalization of relations with the Israeli occupation state. But still, we would like to offer the chance for all of these people that while they are boycotting, while they are refraining from visiting Jerusalem and normalizing the Israeli control over it, they can still read and know and learn about Jerusalem.
Thank you so much. So Fayrouz, we want to take that information that you just gave us and move into the Q&A. We have a few really wonderful questions from the people that have been watching. I'll go through and ask probably 2 to 4 of them. The first question is for you, Marc. They're wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between Black Americans and Palestinians, as well as if there are any connections to, or any nuances to the experiences of Afro-Palestinians. Yeah.
So it's a great question. And I'm glad that Andom began that conversation. I really appreciated all of his analysis, except for the part about basketball. I believe I set a record in Ramallah for victories in basketball games. So I'm currently the champion. That said, I think there's a really interesting relationship between Black Americans and the Palestinian people that is complicated, but certainly long-standing. I'll be brief, but I want to start in 2014 because I think for some people that was the moment of connection. Whereas I would argue, and Noda Adakat and I have argued together in some of our work, that that's a moment of re-energizing. It's a resurgence. In 2014, there were the Ferguson uprisings. We were in the streets of Ferguson fighting the state killing of Michael Brown, an unarmed Black man. And we were responding to weeks and months and decades and years and centuries of state-sanctioned killings of unarmed Black people. And as happens often, every generation, there are moments where, just like with George Floyd a few months ago, there are moments where we take to the streets and we resist. As we were resisting, there was a great amount of Palestinian solidarity. We saw people who were marching with us, who were Palestinian, who were chanting with us, who were getting tear gassed with us. And it was an interesting moment because at that very same time, there was a 51-day war going on in Gaza, where we saw extraordinary levels of disproportionate force used by the Israeli government against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Maybe for the first time of this generation, the news outlets, even mainstream corporate media, were showing images of schools and YMCAs and playgrounds being bombed, children being harmed. And so there was a really interesting moment of intersection between what was happening here in the United States and what was happening in Palestine. And then, of course, there's a sort of historic moment where tweets and messages came from the West Bank, where people like Miriam Barghouti and others were in the West Bank protesting the bombing of Gaza. And they were telling Black American protesters, here's how you wash your eyes out. Here's how you make gas masks. Here's how you run toward the wind, stand closer to the soldier or the officer, distinction without a difference, so that they can, they're less likely to tear gas you. And so the kind of symbolic connection also became a material and tactical one. And for many people, that was the moment of Black Palestinian solidarity. But what I want us to think about in answering the question is sort of how does that stand on the shoulders of decades of solidarity work by people like Angela Davis, by people like June Jordan, by people like Malcolm X. Malcolm X writes his essay Zionist Logic several years before the 1967 war. After the 1967 war, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, publishes a newsletter. Ethel Minor actually writes a newsletter sort of talking about neocolonialism and what it meant for the occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza to be part of a broader project of global colonialism. That stands on the shoulders of the Bandung Conference, where you had brown people around the globe talking about what? Resisting colonialism, resisting imperialism. Now, Black people, there are moments where W.E.B. Du Bois, where Marcus Garvey and other heroes of ours have in many ways identified with the Zionist cause. There's a very unfortunate letter written by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1948, or op-ed that became an essay that sort of supports the formation of the Zionist state built on Orientalist logic, based on sort of dishonest narratives. But it's important to understand that early Black liberation struggles, they did not support colonialism. They did not support the Zionist project as it has played out in its political and material forms since the first Aliyah in 1882. Rather, Black people said, wait a minute, we're oppressed, we're facing violence, we're dying in the same way that our Jewish brothers and sisters are dying in these pogroms where they're dying in Eastern Europe, and we're looking for another place to go. We're looking for the formation of the understanding of us as a collective people, a nation state, and two, or a nation, not a nation state, as a nation, Black folk as a body, as a nation of people. And we want to find a location or a state that will get us there. But as Andom Ghebreghiorgis teaches us, Black folk weren't looking to nation build, we were looking to world make. We weren't trying to replicate the oppressive tactics of Europe. We were trying to refashion and reimagine the world. And so when we saw Jewish brothers and sisters create a new homeland or look for a new homeland, it appealed to us. But what we didn't understand, what they didn't understand, was what was the dislocation and the disruption, the death that would accompany that project. Once we saw that, we took a very different position. That's why Martin Luther King supports the foundation of Israel in 48. But before he dies, he doesn't want to sign on to the letters. He doesn't want to have his picture taken in Bethlehem. He doesn't want to be seen walking through Nazareth because he didn't want to look like he was supporting the occupation. And so there's our relationship is complicated, but it's different. The last part of your question was about Afro-Palestinians. One, I think we should be very careful about that term. When I say Afro-Palestinian, and for those who don't know, I spend way too much time writing and thinking about the Afro-Palestinian question within the context of Palestine, and that's what my anthropological research has been on. When I say Afro-Palestinian, I use that term because they use that term. But I'm speaking specifically about the community inside of the old city of Jerusalem, specifically the community on those two buildings directly in front of Bab el-Majlis, right in front of the Aqsa community. These are people who came within the last 100 years. They came as religious pilgrims. They came as security forces. They came to join the Jaysh al-Inqadh al-Arabi.
Salvation Army.
Salvation, yeah, thank you. My English not so good. The Arab Salvation Army, and they came in very particular ways and became part of the Palestinian project, and now they're on their third and some would argue fourth generation of existence there, and they're very much bound up in the Palestinian project. They are in struggle, right? I mean, Fatima Barnawi was the first woman arrested in the resistance in 1967. You have people like, again, Ali Jeddah, Mohammed Jeddah, who live in the old city, who spent 17 years, fighting and struggling. And Ali was the head within prison, was the head of the Popular Front, the PFLP, the prison representative of the PFLP, in the leadership of George Habash. So the Afro-Palestinian community has a rich and deep legacy there. But there are a lot of other African. Let me say one more thing about that, and then I'll be done, I promise. But I think it's important to understand that while they are Afro-Palestinian and they come from Senegal, Chad, Nigeria, and Sudan, the primary thing, and this is why it's important that we don't take American or Western racial paradigms and use them within the Middle East context or within the Palestinian context. Because while there are Black Palestinians, the thing that racializes you within the context of Palestine is not being of African origin, it's being Palestinian. Ruth Gilmore talks about race and racism as being a set of systems that take a group of people and give them an identity that makes them more likely to experience premature death. The thing in Palestine that makes you experience or susceptible to premature death is not being from Senegal or Chad or Nigeria, it's being Palestinian, right? It's the racialization of the Palestinian within a white settler colonial ethno-nationalist state. It's not being Black. So when I go to Palestine, I can say, oh yeah, there's an Afro-Palestinian, he's like me. But in many ways, the things that make me vulnerable to premature death in the United States are the things that make Palestinians vulnerable to premature death in Palestine. That doesn't mean that there's not anti-Blackness, right? Because there are ways that the Israeli state and Palestinian society engages in forms of white supremacy and anti-Blackness and just good old-fashioned flat-out racism. That community that I'm talking about is still called Habs Habib, right? Even to this day. And so, and that ain't the Israelis doing it, right? So you might get a Kushi on this side, you get an Abid on that side, and you're struggling with both of those things as an Afro-Palestinian. And so that's it. And then the thing that Andom talked about, which is the way race operates also, is that race and Blackness is always a demerit within a white supremacist world. It always makes things harder. But again, when an Afro-Palestinian gets stopped at a checkpoint going back into Jerusalem and they see an Ethiopian soldier, they don't go, woo, my brother. That's their occupier. And yes, Ethiopian soldiers experience their own kind of racism, right? Operation Moses in 84, Operation Solomon in 91, Operation Joshua in 85. They airlifted a bunch of Ethiopians, but think about how late Ethiopians made it to the party. Think about the conditions under which they made it to the party. And Dom's point about Eritreans who are asylum seekers and Sudanese who are asylum seekers, many of those same narratives about infiltration, about disease, about violence were made about the Ethiopians. They had to do symbolic circumcision. They had to convert to Judaism, even though their form of Judaism, temple worship, is older than the forms of rabbinical Judaism being practiced by the people in the Department of Interior, which is the rabbinate. So in other words, they're saying these, and I'm not questioning anybody's Jewishness. I'm saying they're all Jewish, but the Ethiopians were the only ones whose Jewishness got called into question. They were the only ones going into absorption centers. They were the only ones having their movements limited, not the Russians who came to Israel at the same time. And so there's a way that anti-Blackness is pervasive regardless of where you operate on the spectrum, but we don't want to close ranks around Blackness within Palestine in a way that we start to think that, that Blackness is the thing that's the problem, or that Blackness is the primary unit of analysis here. It's very, very complicated, and we have to tease all that stuff out. I try to do a little bit of it, but there's just so much more to be said that we could do it another time.
Thank you. So we have time for about 2 more questions. The first one, a few people have questions about the cable system that you mentioned, Fayrouz. They want to know if you have any more information about when it will begin or when it will be completed, and how can people from the international world support in boycotting it or spreading information about it.
Well, the plan was confirmed, as I said, if I'm not mistaken, early last year. You can Google it, the Jerusalem cable car, and you can read more about it. The construction and the work hasn't started, but I am not sure when it is planned to start. It will take a few years for sure. This is a very big project. And to the part of the question about how we can resist it and boycott it, I think the question is a bit bigger than just the cable car, because usually we have the feeling that every time there is a new Israeli plan, suddenly there is a moment where people who want to be in solidarity start freaking out and saying, oh my God, this is horrible, this is urgent, we need to mobilize, we need to campaign, we need to, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to underestimate or undermine the care and that it's important for people, but I think that we need always to remind ourselves that these plans come one after the other as part of a long-term plan that has been there for over 70 years now. I think that it's important. I mean, we witnessed it in March, we witnessed it in April when they started talking about the annexation plan, and everyone was upset and everyone was terrified, as if the annexation plan is just a new thing that was going to start being implemented on July 1st. That is not the case. These are all puzzle pieces, part of a bigger puzzle that is called the Israeli colonialism in Palestine. And so what I am saying is not sit down and do nothing, but what I am saying is this is old urgency, and we need to step up, we need to speak, we need to change our discourse as well. This is not just one plan that we want to stop. I mean, this is one plan, and then there is the Jerusalem Light Rail with 4 new lines connecting colonies to the city center. And then there is a new industrial zone that was declared near the settlement of Bitar Elit that is going to kill agriculture in villages like Wadi Fukin and Battir and Hussan. So these are all puzzle pieces, parts of a bigger picture. And for us to effectively and efficiently resist all of these plans, people need to start realizing that it's not enough to campaign. It's not enough to tackle one plan or one puzzle piece. It is important that we start realizing and seeing how what is happening in Palestine, which is, by the way, similar to what is happening to so many oppressed groups of people and communities, people of color in the US, indigenous people in the US, formerly and still currently colonized peoples around the world, they all face the same enemy. This is the economic colonization of the global south. It is the economic colonization of Palestine that we need to be resisting. And people need to understand that there is so much they can do about it. I think that first of all, people fail to see how much power they have individually as customers in the world. I think that we as customers tend to see ourselves as helpless, as powerless. We just pick and choose from different products that are sold to us without seeing what huge and big potential and power we have to actually change realities by refusing to buy certain products and refusing to deal with certain companies and corporations. I am saying this because people think that coming to Palestine and volunteering in Palestine for 3 months or campaigning for Palestine from home is everything, all they can do. But people can do so much more. You can do much more by making the right choices about the food you eat and the drinks you drink and the tourism that you make and choices, daily life, consumer changes, decisions change my political reality directly, immediately. And so there is a cable car project. There are probably international corporations and companies that are part of building this cable car. When it comes to the railroad, to the light rail and the new tram lines in Jerusalem, there are European and international companies involved in the building and construction of these lines. So people have also the power to pressure their own companies and corporations back home and say, you will not participate in this and you will not enable Israel's occupation in Palestine and in Jerusalem. I think that people can mobilize in order to make this change back home. I think that people do not get how much they can do for Palestine from back home. And it's not only the economic boycott. Of course, boycotting Israel is on top of my list. Boycotting Israel economically, academically, culturally. Don't host their professors in your universities. Don't host their gigs of their artists in your city. And because this is all enabling Israel. This is all enabling the colonialism in Palestine. But also, I think that people tend to overlook their responsibility and ability to make change in Palestine by making political change back home. I think that people need to see more clearly the direct connection between political change internally inside the US or inside European countries or inside any other country people might be coming from, and how it directly affects my political reality. Because the foreign policy of one's country is very much influenced also by internal policy. And if it's white supremacy, if it's racism, if it's systematic and institutionalized racism, then it means that it will be bad internally and externally towards Palestine or other countries around the world. And so I think that it's important to remind everybody that these are all things that we can, we should, we must do immediately.
Thank you so much. Everything you said actually encompassed a lot of the other questions that were going to be asked. People wanted to know how they can support and how they can support Grassroots Al-Quds, as well as be better allies in general. And yeah, your wisdom is so well appreciated. Thank you so much. We do have time for one more question before we close here. We're wondering if you can speak a little bit more. I know you talked about what Grassroots Al-Quds is already doing. Can you speak a little bit more on any future plans for the organization, especially in the context of the pandemic, and how local businesses in East Jerusalem might also be affected?
Answering about Jerusalem first, merchants and business owners and shopkeepers in Jerusalem are suffering a lot. Again, Jerusalem, to begin with, even before the pandemic, before the closure, Jerusalem was a very expensive city to live for Palestinians. And with an 80% officially, 80% poverty rate among Palestinians in Jerusalem, with Jerusalem being one of the most expensive cities in the world, you can already imagine how hard it is for Palestinians to simply finish the month in Jerusalem with a roof over their head. And I'm talking about economically, not even about home demolition or legal status revocation or anything else that is a serious and real threat all the time, but just economically. And so with the pandemic, with the closure, with the halting of any tourism, no tourism, no visitors arriving in Jerusalem, then the economy is also suffering. And with 40% of our economy dependent on tourism, the situation is very challenging and very hard for these Palestinian business owners and shopkeepers in Jerusalem. Which also is the same for us as an organization, because as an organization, I was explaining before that we started as a very traditional organization when it came to our funding and to our plans, and with the growth that we went through, we also decided that as an organization, we need to break free of donors and of donor systems. And that is why we started generating our own income through the sales of our tours and our books. And we also depend a lot on support from our friends and supporters and people who simply appreciate our work. And so before the pandemic, our plans, as I was saying, were to tour with Wujood, with the second edition of the book in the US. We already toured it with it in Europe last fall, and we were planning on coming to the US with it, and we were hoping other places as well. But now with all of the changes that are happening, we are also finding ourselves adjusting to this new reality. So there are certain projects that we were doing before and we are continuing with. Our plans for the near future are to launch a mobile phone application of Wujood for people also to be able to find all of that practical information and context on their phones as they tour inside the city or around Palestine. We are also working in tourism, which is now it seems like this campaign is going to be postponed a bit further, but we are also working on enhancing the movement of tourists and visitors to villages and neighborhoods of Jerusalem that are marginalized, that are many of them located behind the wall, so separated from Jerusalem by the wall. So a tourism campaign that invites and encourages people to visit these communities and support their steadfastness by supporting their economy, by visiting them and spending some of that money there responsibly. We will, I mean, the new thing that we are doing is turn our political tour into a virtual tour that people can take, because it's not only about making the income from the tour, but also spreading that knowledge. That is very important for us to tell people. It's very important for us to put that information and knowledge out there for people to know better about the reality and the details and the Palestinian lives in Jerusalem. And so we will also be offering our tours online, hopefully in a couple of months.
I agree.
Fayrouz, really quickly before we close, there are a few questions about how to get the book in a hard copy version. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, we are also looking into that. Unfortunately, the book is not yet sold around the world. There are a few places in Europe that are selling the book. You can find that information on our website. And now we are also looking into how we can sell Wujood around the world. And I think that in the meantime, people will have to contact us and order the book, and we can ship it to them. But in the meantime, the PDF version is online. It is available. People can buy the PDF version. The links have been shared in the chat throughout the event today. And hopefully, soon enough, we will be printing it in other countries around the world and having it available for people to buy at their favorite revolutionary bookshops.
Amazing. So like Fayrouz was saying, you can get the PDF version. We've put the links in the chat, as well as links to their PayPal to support in any way that you can. Also, with all those updates that Fayrouz explained with Grassroots Al-Quds, you can like their Facebook page or their Instagram page to keep updated and see about the phone copy version and the online tour that they're working on. But yeah, thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you so much, Fayrouz and Marc. Your wisdom is so appreciated. Thank you, Andom and Ramah. It was a really, really wonderful time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zaina.
Thank you, Zaina.
Okay.